Hi, I'm David Korn.
And I'm Jim Pinkerton. And together
we're bloggingheads.tv.
Yeah, back again.
Yet again. And I know you're here to talk, Jim, about that tremendous political sweep we just experienced. You know, I just can't believe that when it came to those two seats, the Democrats swept. I mean, those two congressional seats that that will help decide the future of health care and Afghanistan policy and everything else, they both went Democratic, including the one seat that was held by the Republicans since the days of Ulysses S. Grant. What an amazing accomplishment for the Democrats. They held a seat, in California, usually easy territory for them, but then won in upstate New York in Republican turf. After all this money and effort been thrown into that seat by prominent conservatives and working hand in hand eventually with the Republican establishment. What does this say about the Obama presidency? Is it just, is this a referendum? Are people out there just so happy with what he's doing in healthcare or trying to do that they're electing more Democrats in the House? I mean, right now there's a bigger House majority for the Democrats than there was when he first took office. Amazing, isn't it?
Well, that's one interpretation. What was, and everything you said about the two elections, including the Democratic pickup in New York, is true. However, I think...
There's a however here?
Most people would probably concede that a Republican victory in New Jersey, beating the extremely well-financed Democratic incumbent, and a landslide Republican victory in Virginia, a state that had gone pretty Democratic in the last 2 or 3 election cycles, where 28 counties that Obama carried this last year went Republican for McDonnell, sweeping in, I think for only the second time in Republican Virginia history, not only the governor, but also the lieutenant governor and the attorney general, and I think at last count 5 seats in the legislature. Those are pretty big victories for the Republicans, and I think it's no accident that the Democratic timetable on the health care bill keeps slipping back now, per the Washington Post this morning, into next year.
Well, I think we have a mixed message. I mean, of course, on the Virginia contest, the voters stayed true to a 36-year-long trend that whoever wins the White House the next year loses the Virginia governor's seat. It goes back even through the days of your pal Ronald Reagan and, of course, George H.W. Bush. But this is, I think we all hyperventilate on these off-year elections when the sampling is pretty small. And, I did think that I thought Corzine had a chance in New Jersey, but with 9.7, 9.8% unemployment there, an $8 billion state budget deficit, that was a pretty heavy burden to carry. And I think it is cautionary to both sides. For the Democrats, it doesn't matter whether the George W. Bush economic policies led to the economic doldrums we're still experiencing, and we can argue that back and forth forever. But nevertheless, if you're in office, you're held accountable, and after a year or so of 10% or near 10% or over 10% unemployment, it's going to be very hard for any incumbent not to worry about being booted out. And I think independents are going to be the ones who are getting more antsy about some of these policy measures and about the economy at large.
But David, don't you find it curious that if the hot issues in the country, and I agree with you, the economy is the number one issue, are jobs and housing prices and home mortgages and general housing meltdown, that the Obama administration chose to focus on health insurance and cap and trade? Isn't that a strange set of priorities?
Well, no. They spent, I think you didn't like this at the time, they spent nearly $1 trillion in stimulus, and by a lot of economists' reading of what's currently happened, the GDP growth of this quarter, what is it, 3.5% or so, is partly attributed to that, and perhaps, this is the problem with public policy and politics. If they hadn't done that, maybe unemployment would be 15% or 12% or 10.1%. So they have not been insensitive to jobs.
They've been completely insensitive. They've been very sensitive on bailing out Wall Street. They've been very sensitive on bailing out Acorn and favored constituents. What they haven't done is created jobs.
Don't get distracted by any of the Acorn BS, okay?
I'm sorry. I'll find it better.
They haven't done anything for Acorn. But they spent $1 trillion in stimulus. They also bailed out the auto companies, and they bailed out the banks. These are three things they've all done, more or less at the same time. Now, you and I both disagree together with some of the bailout policies. But it's not as if that's all they've done. And...
What's striking to me is this is a Democratic president who doesn't think that fighting unemployment is a very high priority. That's striking to me.
Where do you get that?
Because unemployment has gone from 7.2 to 9.8 during his presidency.
But he spent $1 trillion trying to.
But he didn't spend it hiring people. He gave it to middlemen. I mean, again, what Roosevelt did in the 30s was he simply put people on the government payroll.
Okay,
that was the WPA and the
CCC. Are you in favor of a new WPA?
I am, actually, yes.
Oh, well, something else that the left and right agrees on blogging@TV. You've seen it here first. And I hope they hire all the Woody Guthries of today as well for the public works side of that. And, and we start painting great dams with wonderful art of...
But if we do infrastructure, I'm not too keen on public art, frankly. If Obama had sat around and said we're going to build some high-speed rail and some ports and some airports and some nuclear power plants, I think unemployment would have gone down and the stimulus package would have been a lot more popular. Instead, I think you can fairly say that this stimulus package, the stimulus package they put forward, has done nothing to alleviate unemployment, which, again, as I said, has risen 2.5 points since he took office.
There is no way you can tell.
Well, except the Obama, Christina Romer said unemployment would peak at 8%.
Well, they thought unemployment would peak at 8% by the middle of the year. I mean, they misread and they miscalculated. But that doesn't mean that the money they spent did nothing. I mean, they have spent money on light rail and trains, and those are the projects that actually take longer to produce jobs. Some of the other things they've done, and you can argue with any particular line item in the stimulus, and there's a lot there that I didn't like too. But you just can't say, Jim, that no jobs, all the civil sector jobs, whether they're teachers or cops and firefighters, rescue workers, EMT people, that are there, hundreds of thousands by some estimations. Those are jobs that were either saved or created. I mean,
they saved or created according to their precise number.
That's not doing nothing.
Okay.
And those are jobs that probably have a pretty good, draft in terms of keeping communities together, which is better for employment than letting communities have more crime.
So my original question was: do you think the Obama administration was wise to focus on a stimulus package that didn't reduce unemployment? If I'll give you that one. So they produced a non-job creating stimulus package that lost a net of, I think, 4 million jobs across the country in the last year, last 9 months, and then they focused on health insurance and cap and trade. Was that a wise use of the president's first year in office?
As Robert Gibbs would say, I don't accept your initial premise that it was a stimulus package that led to the loss of jobs.
Except it did. I mean, what can you say except it did? Unemployment's 2.5% higher.
Jim, if you're about to put $500,000 in an investment, and I come up to you and say, hey, don't do that, it's a bad investment, and the investment goes broke, and you didn't put the money in, I helped you prevent the loss of $500,000. I mean, if you do something that prevents unemployment from going up to 12% rather than to 10%, that's better than just not doing anything and saying the 12%. You're talking about a hypothesis that can't be proven.
No, you're right. We're both talking about hypotheses that can't be proven. All we're left with, though, is the empirical fact that, unlike the New Deal, unemployment has in 1933, when President Roosevelt immediately set about cutting unemployment. The unemployment rate during the entire Depression peaked in March of 1933 and went down every month thereafter. Obama chose an opposite course. That's all.
I don't think it's. I think he. Well,
that's just true.
No, I don't think he chose an opposite course. I think he is trying to do what he can about unemployment. Now,
okay. Boy, you're really in the tank for the guy today, aren't you?
No. Listen, I think you're. I don't disagree with your analysis. I just think you're putting it in extreme terms. That the guy chose not to do anything about unemployment. That's just simply not true. But let's go back to the elections. Okay, let's just go back because I'm really curious. What your take is on the battle of NY23. Okay. And what you think this means for the public. Because I have my own views, but you go first.
It was a fiasco. The Republican Party and the conservative movement have to have a long sit-down session with each other and figure out how to, from the Republican conservative point of view, how to. I mean, I'm sure you're delighted, but from our point of view, we have to figure out how to keep that from happening again. It was clearly a debacle of picking a candidate who was too far to the left for the Republican Party and the conservative movement writ large. Hoffman, on the other hand,
was she right for the district, perhaps?
Probably not. I mean, probably card check and gay marriage are to the left of even that district. I mean, she's just a left-wing Charles Goodell type Republican, and that's just too much even for Republicans up there. Hoffman was a terrible candidate, and so we lost a seat. And it's just a lesson that conservatives can't win outside of the Republican Party, and Republicans can't win without conservatives. This is what party. I had a piece in the Politico's Arena this morning. This is Wednesday, in which I said that there's a trend in American politics toward what I called centrifugalism, which is sort of going outward from the core.
Say that again slower.
Centrifugalism, as in centrifugal force.
Right. Centrifugal force.
All the sort of social, cultural indicators, the internet and talk radio and the general sort of, fragmentation of large institutions is pushing authority and power away from the core and toward the periphery. That's just the centrifugal force. It's what move on.
Things are spinning out of control.
Things are spinning out of control. I mean, in the sense of there used to be a more established orthodoxy that was sort of in charge of things. Mm-hmm. Now, that can be good or bad depending on your point of view. But what is clear, though, is that American politics are still. And I actually had a piece on this in the Huffington Post as well. So I had both Huffington Post yesterday and Politico this morning, sort of making this point.
You're on a roll, Jim.
I am on a roll. American politics at its core is not centrifugal, it's centripetal. As in, the nature of the two-party system means that if you want to actually win an election, you have to work with one of the two parties. I mean, for 150 years, the two parties have dominated American politics. There have been plenty of attempts to start third parties, and they usually have always fizzled in that time. So you need to have, if the old establishment couldn't deliver a satisfactory result, then you need a new establishment. Then maybe you need to defenestrate the old establishment and put in a new one. But the new establishment has to come in and say, look, if we nominate somebody, that is broadly acceptable to the bulk of our party and our movement, then we all have to gather around and support him or her. This is what the left has to do too, by the way. If the left wants to win, Move On can knock off, Harry Reid and Evan Bayh and whoever else they don't like, or Lieberman. But they have to have a plan for electing somebody in their place as opposed to just losing.
Yes.
So that's the challenge. Again, both parties face. But the Republicans faced it last night in New York, 23, and they lost.
Well,
but I think that same token, though, just to finish the thought, the unbelievable energy against Obama and against the Democratic agenda, I think is going to kibosh anything but the most absolutely rock-bottom minimum health care plan and derail any further phony-baloney stimulus plans and cap and trade that the Democrats might have in mind.
Well, I'm not sure there's unbelievable energy against Obama if that indeed were the case. I don't think New Jersey would have been close, and I don't think NY23 would have gone to the D's. But that said, your point, your larger point, is essentially, it's harder to make trees. Only God can make a tree, but it's easy to cut them down. Putting together a not just a governing coalition, but a winning coalition is a lot easier than coming in and running a campaign against someone, particularly on your own side of the ideological fence. And it was interesting to me looking at sort of now NY23 in the aftermath. Prior to this, it was considered to be a big win for the conservatives, for Tea Party activists, teabaggers, whatever you want to call them, who were flocking to this front in the internal Republican Civil War. And you had people like Newt Gingrich on one side versus Sarah Palin, of course, on the other side. And up until, I think it was about 12:05 on 5 minutes past midnight on election night, when Doug Hoffman, quickly conceded, the conservative activists, the Tea Party folks, were already drawing up lists of the next targets, the next rhinos, Republicans in name only, they call these people, who they were going to go after. And in the last few days, they've talked about Charlie Crist down in Florida, the governor there who's running for Senate, who faces Marco Rubio, a conservative state senator in a primary. They're talking about going after Mark Kirk, a Republican member of the House in Illinois, who seems to have a pretty good line on winning Barack Obama's Senate seat. And they're talking about even going after Bob Bennett, a Utah Republican senator who's up for re-election, who has a conservative challenger, who has announced that Joe the plumber will be campaigning for her. So I've been wondering this, and I wrote about this at motherjones.com and politicsdaily.com to plug my recent work as well. That is it possible here that Sarah Palin and the others have, in a way, unleashed the hounds? Can Palin and Tim Pawlenty really now sort of go after Charlie Crist? I mean, it's one thing to take out a no-name assemblywoman in upstate New York on the grounds of ideological impurity, but with the activists and these base conservatives now calling for the scalps of these more establishment Republicans, including those, including Charlie Crist, who is in a very important presidential primary state. Will Palin, Pawlenty, Fred Thompson, your friend Huckabee, follow the pack, or will they, be run over by the pack if they don't want to continue to play that game?
Well, we'll see. I would say that in Florida, Rubio, the challenger, is a very attractive candidate. He's the former Speaker of the House. He's no wingnut and no parvenu to politics. And so, look, parties benefit oftentimes from competitive primaries and active grassroots participation. That's true for the Democrats as well. The challenge comes if the challenge is, can they coalesce around the nominee once that person wins? And for example, in 2006 in Connecticut, when the Democrats knocked off Joe Lieberman, he turned around and ran as an independent and held the seat. Not at all what the Democratic left had in mind. Again, these are...
That was important also because of Republican, I won't call it shenanigans. They were very smart.
No, it's entirely possible.
They nominated somebody weak and didn't give him any support.
It is a challenge to party mechanics in both sides to constructively harness the energy of their activists in ways that lead to victory. I mean, as I said, the lesson of New York 23 is that conservatives can't win without Republicans, and that Republicans can't win without conservatives. They're both true statements. It's not my job It's up to the Republican establishment and the activists to get together and figure out how to put themselves together.
I know it's not your job, but let me ask you anyway. If you have the activists moving off and saying in an extreme direction, and you could say that I thought it was the appropriate direction, but you can say in the 60s the anti-war left and the Democrats might, and attacking Humphrey and the establishment Democrats might be a somewhat of a political corollary, not substance-wise. But if you have sort of the, the Tea Party wing, having demonstrations in which they're, calling Obama Hitler and citing death panels that don't exist, and being very extreme in their rhetoric and their desires, does that make it a little more challenging to sort of figure out how do you deal with those sort of supporters?
Sure. And as I said, we're going through a centrifugal phase in politics where everybo's a publisher. Everybody with a Photoshop can make their own picture of Obama as Hitler, and you can do anything you want now. And there aren't a lot of guidepost structures that say to anybody who feels like they want to upend the apple cart, hey, knock it off, don't do it.
Well, another interesting...
The point's been made that the Internet turns everybody into his or her own
actor.
Gutenberg, with their own printing press. Nobody... This is
their own Goebbels.
This is an unbelievable challenge to both parties. Again, look, the Republicans now, the Democrats are in, and the Democrats have the majority in Congress, and they control the presidency, and so, by definition, if the status quo is serving them, at least from a partisan point of view, pretty well. The Republicans have to figure out what they did successfully in New Jersey. In New Jersey, there was a conservative and a moderate in the primary.
Yep.
The moderate, Christie, won the primary, and the conservatives fell in the line behind Christie, and he won. In Virginia, McDonnell, I guess it was a convention state, so McDonnell pretty much was the consensus nominee of the party, and won a sweeping victory.
Let me ask you if you think there's if there's a gap between these statewide candidates, Christie and McDonnell. McDonnell, wasn't a moderate, but kind of ran with, the themes of a moderate, at least problem solving, and not ideological, not a strong social agenda. But I think there's a gap between those two guys and congressional Republicans. A poll came out just a few days ago showing that the question was asked, do you have a positive opinion of the Republican Party? And it was 25% said yes. It was one of the lowest numbers in years. Even during the Bush years, it never got that low. And by comparison's sake, even though you don't like the health care bill and cap and trade and the stimulus package that was passed by Congress, the Democrats were at 42%. Which I thought was not bad given the state of unemployment these days. So, but I'll go back to my original question here. Do you think there's a gap between congressional Republicans, whatever is happening in Washington, and these sort of non-ideological, people at least posing as non-ideological Republican candidates in those two statewide races?
Yes, I do. I think that there is a gap, and I think that the experience. That's why I'm a big fan of governors. As a group, and I would even include Democratic governors in this category. Governors in both parties tend to be, frankly, somewhat similar when it comes to creating jobs and dealing with problems and so on and so on. You can have better governors and you can have worse governors, but they all tend to think in terms of what does it take to get a factory to move here to my state, and that practical experience gives them, to me, an enormous advantage over members of Congress. I heard Judd Gregg recently. He's a senator from New Hampshire.
Almost was Commerce Secretary in the Obama administration.
Almost the Commerce Secretary for the Obama administration. Who also, among other things, was a congressman, but also a governor of New Hampshire. And he said that, look, when I was governor of New Hampshire, if I would wake up, come to my office, and there'd be 5 problems on my desk. And if those 5 problems were still on my desk at the end of the day, I fired somebody. and by contrast,
New Hampshire's not that big a state. That's why everybody in New Hampshire has something on their resume. Worked for Governor Gregg.
By contrast, if you're in Congress,
I don't think you can do that.
The 5 problems staying on your desk for 30 years, and nobody holds you or anybody else responsible for solving them. So yes, I think governors are the natural talent pool for, frankly, for both parties when it comes to leadership.
Well, Governor Pawlenty, who seems to be one of the contenders for 2012, did get involved in New York 23 on the what turned out to be the losing side. I forget, did Huckabee did as well, didn't he?
I'm not exactly sure. Huckabee, who I'm a big fan of and worked for in 2008, yes. I'm not running from him. I just don't know. Huckabee, I don't think endorsed Hoffman until after sort of the entire Republican establishment
once it was safe.
We're endorsing Hoffman.
Once it was safe.
In other words, I don't think. I mean, Pawlenty was there. Pawlenty and Palin and David Keene, who's not a governor but is a well-known activist. There were a few others who,
Glenn Beck and so on.
Steve Forbes, who noisily endorsed Hoffman when he was not the Republican nominee. But I mean, look, I mean. I at least have to go in a moment. So let me just ask you about a separate matter, because it's something that we've often talked about here, and that let's just go to Afghanistan just for a few moments. A couple of weeks ago, Cheney made headlines, accusing Obama of dithering as he holds these sessions with his national security team and the commanders and plots a way forward. I'm just curious, as a policy-minded individual, do you think what he's doing is dithering, or do you think this is actually a useful process? I mean, you've worked in the White House right.
on the domestic side, not the foreign policy side as well. So just in looking at how Obama is sort of trying to figure out the answer to Afghanistan, my personal view is there is no right answer. But nevertheless, what do you make of the process?
Well, I think a lot of it depends on the expectations you set up. I mean, Obama's problem. I mean, first of all, as you know, I am skeptical of all these nation-building foreign military exercises. No. I think we did the right thing in going to Afghanistan in 2001, and then clearly somewhere along the line, during the Bush years, frankly, we went below the curve on below the middle point of effectiveness and efficacy there, and we went from chasing after terrorists and protecting America into a sort of half-hearted, diverted attention, nation-building effort in Afghanistan while we put most of our effort in Iraq. And so this is clearly a problem that Obama inherited. This was not his idea. The huge mistake that Obama made was to say that in March he had a comprehensive strategy,
right. Mm-hmm.
Then to fire the commander and bring in his own commander. And if you fire the old guy and bring in the new guy, you're sort of obligated by all sort of common sense to listen to what he says.
Right.
And then in August to reaffirm that Afghanistan is necessary. I mean, if Obama didn't want to do a surge in Afghanistan, he shouldn't have set things in motion that would communicate to everybody, including General McChrystal, that that's exactly what he wanted. Mm-hmm. That was a horrible mistake that Obama made. That, again, is not the same as fighting a stupid war for no good reason, but it's a horrible mistake in terms of his own leadership credibility.
So where do you think we are now, then, with what he's doing?
I think that, I'm pretty sure I said this on Blogging Heads before, I think that Obama will eventually get talked into sort of a Nixonian approach to Afghanistan, which is don't lose between now and the next election.
Right.
What do you think?
I think he's going. I'm not sure I'd put it that way, but what I think might end up at the same point. I think he's going to try to thread a needle, and I think he's going to try to build up certain civilian capacities and give it a shot, and probably put in some extra troops. But I'm certainly, I mean, I won't say certain, no one's certain about anything, but I'd be surprised if it was everything McChrystal's asking for. I think the Biden counterterrorism strategy, which is different from the counterinsurgency strategy, I think won't be adopted fully, but will have certainly some at least some political, attraction to it for Obama and everybody else. I mean, I do think this is a situation where, as I said earlier, there is no good choice. There is no right policy choice. I mean, I talk to people on all sides of the issues who and I consider each one of them to be, trying in good faith to come up with a good course. And we're not talking about in terms of political terms, what to do to make sure nothing goes worse before the 2010 or 2012 elections. Smart folks will come up with very different conclusions on what's to be done. And we've talked about this in the past, too. You read the McChrystal report, and it looks like it is almost entirely a bridge too far. I do think in terms of what you said about the Bush strategy, in some ways, I think it wasn't that they sort of, chose nation building over, say, getting Al-Qaeda at Tora Bora or any other place. I think everything they did was just half-hearted down the line once they focused on Iraq. And, is there a strategy here? I've talked to some, civilian types of just putting in, money in a way. You give them to women's groups, and you just start building schools and worrying less about holding territory with troops and more about, trying, to build on a local level, not big AID projects, building roads that you have to secure big swaths of territory to succeed in, but you try to find a way, and the difficulty here would be going around the corrupt Karzai government and finding, grassroots activities that you can support. I mean, the one good thing, well, not one, but one of the good things about Afghanistan is that an American dollar, as devalued as it might be in some places, still goes pretty damn far in Afghanistan. And I just don't. I think our whole aid strategy there has probably been too top down and not in sync with what we like to think of as real smart soft power.
I suspect all the people we gave money to for their women's centers would all get murdered the day after they got the check from us.
Well, some might, but they're being murdered already.
Well, and, right. But the thing is, look
what happened in the border regions of Pakistan, where the Taliban was ruling. Eventually, the locals who weren't too keen on either the Pakistan government or, of course, the Yankee Americans, got fed up with the Taliban, and made it easier to drive them out. In some ways, I think you and I probably agree. We can't win the war for the people on the ground if there's a societal conflict. But by giving more resources to the right side in a smart fashion, that might be a way to serve.
Yeah, no, it probably couldn't be worse than what we have now. Did you read the article, by the way, in the New York Times by that fellow Sebastian about the Soviets in Afghanistan?
I've read a lot about the Soviets in Afghanistan.
It was maybe a week ago or so, and it just was. They've got all these Kremlin leaders. I didn't know this. It's all written memoirs, and all the minutes of their various meetings have come out. And there's a quote in there from some Soviet general saying, "Look, we won 99% of our battles against the Mujahideen." And yet here we are still losing. I mean, it's the same thing that
that's just like
General
Vietnam.
General Giap said to Harry Summers in Vietnam.
Who
cares if you win the battles? We're winning the war. Yeah. And I think that all this stuff falls in that category. I think on this one we sort of agree. I think Obama will decide he doesn't want to lose before the 10 midterms for sure, and then before the 12 elections, and then we'll look for whatever decent interval we can find after that.
One concern I have politically, as somebody who would like to see the president succeed, that puts me opposite Glenn Beck and Rush Limbaugh, but is that I sense, and I'll probably be writing about this in the next couple of days if I have a moment, the possibility of a rising credibility gap, and people over a certain age will remember what that means and how it came out of the Vietnam experience. I mean, the Obama administration, after Karzai, wins in a runoff election because the guy opposite him pulls out, claiming there'll be too much fraud. The message, in essence, from Robert Gibbs this week at the White House was practically the system worked. And in one round of questioning, I said to him, wait a second. The system only worked because one guy said there was too much fraud to put the system to the test. And I think on a lot of different aspects of presenting the Afghanistan policy to the American public, the White House is sort of gilding the lily and not being straightforward. Now, I understand it's very hard when you're asking young men and women to die on missions over there. It's hard for the president to come out and say, you know what, we're just kind of screwed, and we have to muddle through this the best we can. But but I think right now the public's very skeptical of all whatever might happen, whatever he might do in Afghanistan. And if he wants to buy some time, particularly getting past maybe the next election or two, I think Obama's going to have to find a way. It's not my job here. But find a way to communicate realistically to the American public expectations, but also aims, and do that in a way that doesn't further alienate the public from the mission, whatever it may be, because I do think we're very close to people just looking at him on Afghanistan and saying he's not telling us the truth. And I think if that happens, given how difficult the policy matter this is, then he really will be in a pretty bad place politically, may affect coming elections, but also I think it'll make it harder to do anything policy-wise.
Yeah, no, it is extremely hard to convince the American military and American soldiers, all of whom are volunteers, that they're fighting kind of a holding action on behalf of some sort of half-believed foreign policy abstraction. I mean, we sort of went through that in Vietnam and elsewhere. I mean, we don't have a military oriented toward sort of
fighting
imperial
for the worst
constabulary functions.
Yeah, fighting for the worst, or for the better of two bad options.
Right.
It's hard to fight for the better of two bad options.
Right, and it's also I'm also puzzled, and I think this is something that the Obama people share with the Bush administration, is this how we manage to use democracy as a tool against sort of our own interests to help foster people who don't like us, or undercut the people who do like us. It's not really clear to me that democracy made things better in the West Bank and Gaza. It's not clear to me that democracy has made things better in Pakistan.
I think you have to acknowledge.
And it's not clear to me that undercutting Karzai like this makes our situation better in Afghanistan.
Yeah, well, I think you have to acknowledge in certain ways that the Obama people don't adopt that rhetoric as the Bush people did, and their problem in talking about democracy in Afghanistan, their real key focus is try to convince the public that there is a partner in Afghanistan who can be worked with, when that may well not be the case. It's not. I'm not saying it's any better or worse, but it's sort of a different.
Fair enough. But did it help the situation to force Karzai to agree to a runoff back a month ago? Did that help?
I think. Well, I think on the surface marginally, but when it comes to the root, no.
Okay. I mean, to me, it made him look weak. It emasculated him in terms of Afghanistan politics. It says, listen, you just do what the Americans tell you to, which is never a good thing for a third world leader, or would-be third world leader to do. And then after having gotten him to agree to the runoff, then Abdullah takes himself out, which only proves that the whole thing was a farce. But it proves that Karzai is kind of a stooge of the Americans.
Well, yes and no. I think over there he can certainly sell this as he outfoxed the Americans.
Okay. Yeah, you're right. He can do that. But then why do we then sort of a lose-lose? Karzai is sort of seen as somebody...
I think from our end, Karzai is a lose-lose situation. I think there's no doubt about it. And and the challenge for the Obama people is trying to minimize that loss while trying to proceed forward with whatever policy they put together. And Peter Galbraith and others he worked for the UN commission there. He was number 2 there, and left because he was thought the UN folks were trying to put too pretty a picture, pretty a face on the fraud there. It's basically said that this is indeed that Karzai and working with him is indeed a fraud. So, and these are going to be issues, political and policy issues, that are going to be fought and not across ideological lines in the next year or two. It's more so than healthcare. I think this will be the bigger challenge, and in some ways perhaps the biggest threat for and to the Obama presidency. And on that cheery note.
On that note, as liberals think about what would have happened if President Kennedy hadn't been assassinated, and think to themselves, gee, what would you have done in Vietnam?
Yeah. Well, I'm sure Rahm Emanuel and David Axelrod are watching and thinking about this as we talk about it.
Anyway, well, they should be. They learned what they did. Anyway.
Well, anyway, Jim, thanks as always. And
as always.
And hopefully I'll see you and the audience out there, because they don't know this, but we can actually see them thanks to technology that Robert Wright got from the NSA. So please, that bathrobe a little closer together. But I hope I see you soon.
Thank you. Talk soon. All right. Bye-bye.